Hello, friends. Welcome to another lecture of Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology and Ganga Jamni Joint Series. Today, being a Friday, we are to discuss sources for the study of medieval Indian history. It is not every day that one is called upon to introduce your own student who is going to deliver a lecture. Lubna Irfan is an assistant professor of history at Women's College, AMU. She has recently submitted her thesis on the topic Secular Public Utilitarian Buildings of North India 1200 to 1750. She has also authored a number of research papers, participated in a number of national and international seminars, and has a sizable presence on social media as a percolator of knowledge of history. Her areas of interest are history of art and architecture, popular history, socio-cultural history, and gender history. She has participated in a number of national and international conferences and has a number of publications to her credit. Her recent paper, entitled Ambiguous Life of the Servile Public in Mughal India, is due to release in a special issue of the Journal of South Asian History and Culture. She participated in international colloquium organized by European University at St. Petersburg, Russia, and presented her paper on the topic The Disappearance of the Public Spaces of Coffee House in the Mughal Shahjahanabad, Delhi, which took place in October 2020. She presented another paper entitled Unearthing the History of the Servants in Mughal India, The Ambiguous Life of the Servile Public, which was presented in the second international conference held at Humboldt University, Berlin in 2018. As a researcher, she very ably edited the Bulletin of Sultania Historical Society, the online journal of one of the oldest society of AMU. She was actively involved in organizing weekly seminars of the department between 2017 and 20. In 2016, she curated a 4-day students' seminar on India, A Road to Nation and Freedom, where scholars like Professor Aditya and Mridula Mukherjee, as well as Irfan Habib and Chiri Musfi, took part. Lubna is one of the founder members of ASHA. She is also the founder of a website, Itihas Ke Karigar, which is a part of her attempt to popularize history. She also actively contributes to online web portals in an attempt to take history to the masses. In her association with India Heritage Walks, she has contributed significant write-ups to their virtual walk series. She has organized a virtual heritage walk of Mayo College structures for India Heritage Walks on 31st October 2020. Today, she is going to introduce to us a very important source for the Mughal period, the Zakhiratul Khawaneen of Sheikh Farid Bhakkari. Over to you, Lubna.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, Professor Rizvi, for this detailed introduction. And before beginning with my presentation, I would just state that I am humbled and I am honored to be speaking on this platform, which has seen a plethora of scholars ranging from our pioneers from our department and also from international scholarship. We have seen a range of scholars speak on this platform, and for me to be able to speak from here is a great privilege, great honor, and I'm honestly humbled and a little nervous to be speaking here. As Professor Rizvi said, I'm going to introduce a source on which I have been working on for around 5 years now. It is a Tazkira. I'll start sharing my slides and then we can go about the presentation. I'll give you details of various aspects. I'll just share the screen. I hope my slides are visible. Is it visible, sir?
Yes, Lubna, your slides are visible, but you'll have to make it full screen.
Yes, I will. Okay, thank you so much, Shagufta. So this is I'll in the beginning I'll give you an overview of what my talk is going to be. So I'll first introduce the source, what is the genre, what is the style, and then we'll talk about the reception of the source, both at the time when it was composed and in the modern times. I'll give you a brief overview of the author, because author criticism is always important to understand the source and to how to use the information produced in the source. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction of Sheikh Farid Bhakkari. And then I'm going to go ahead and talk about the information contained in the source. I have looked at this information from a particular angle, from my areas of interests, and the details of the
Excuse me,
source.
PowerPoint तो full screen पे कर लो.
So I have done it. I think there might be some issue with the connection, but I have shared it on full screen now. So yes, so I'm going to go ahead with the nature of information that is contained in the source according to my categories of analysis. Beginning with the first topic or first thing that I'm going to deal with in the talk is the genre and the style of the source. So the source, Zakhiratul Khawanin, is technically a tazkira. Tazkira is a biographical dictionary. Primarily, tazkiras were written about great religious figures. In a similar lecture that we had with Asha and Ganga Jamani, Professor Habib talked about tazkiras which talked about Sufis and their lives. So those are the tazkiras that are there, which deal with religious figures, Sufis, and we have a number of tazkiras that deal with religious figures. But this one that I am going to deal with today is not dealing with the religious figures or any Sufis, but it is going to talk about the Mughal nobles, the Mughal nobility. It is an account. It's a biographical dictionary which contains detailed accounts of various Mughal nobles, ranging from the time of Akbar to the time of Shah Jahan. It is till 1651, the nobility that was there, and like the people who were there in the Mughal bureaucracy. The source contains information about their lives, where do they belong, what were their interests. So those are the details that are provided there. We're going to look into.
Excuse me, Lubna, your PowerPoint is not full screen. It is showing the entire screen. उसको सिर्फ PowerPoint पे करो. या फिर शगुफ्ता को email कर दो. She will do it.
I'll just share it again.
Lubna, just do F5.
Is it visible now?
No, your entire screen is visible. It should not be the entire screen.
Give me just 1 second. I'll share it with Shagufta.
While you're doing that,
Email it to Shagufta. Email it to Shagufta.
I will do that. So just a second. While I share the PowerPoint, I'll just talk about the source and what is that particular source about. The idea is that it is a Tazkira which talks about biographical dictionaries of Mughal nobles. It contains information from the time of Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan. And the details that are provided in that particular source are really intriguing for a student of history who's working on socio-cultural aspects of Mughal life, Mughal culture, Mughal society. So I am going to look at the source from this angle. And before going into those details, I hope Shagufta would share the slides now so that it would be more convenient for the audience to see what I'm talking about and to understand what I'm talking about. Shagufta, can you please share the PPT now? I have sent it to you.
I haven't received it yet. On your end, try to do F5. While Lubna returns, I think, sir, could you? I actually read a wonderful article today, sir, by you on this topic. So while we are working on the logistics, um, could you share something about it? Thanks, Lubna.
There was some internet issues. Lubna, can you start once again? You start from, say, 2 minutes back, what you were saying that was lost.
Okay, I'll start from the very beginning. So today I'm going to talk about this Tazkira. It's a biographical dictionary. Tazkiras were mostly written about religious figures. Irfan Habib, in one of the previous lectures on this platform, talked about Sufi Tazkiras, where he talked about how the religious figures were depicted in those biographical dictionaries. I am today talking about a Tazkira which does not talk about religious figures, but talks about the Mughal nobility. And the time period that it looks at is a wide time period. It starts from the time period of Akbar. It talks about the nobles who worked under Akbar and who were employed under Akbar. And then it goes ahead to talk about Jahangir's time and ends at Shah Jahan, during Shah Jahan's reign, because the text was compiled in 1651 and it contains information about Mughal nobility, about Mughal bureaucracy till that particular period of time, till 1651. So this is a brief overview of the Tazkira that I'm talking about. I, at the very beginning, would like to state that this Tazkira is not the only one of its kind. There are a number of Tazkiras that were written mostly after this particular Tazkira. Especially one needs to be mentioned, and that is Masirul Umara. Masirul Umara is important because Masirul Umara is in a way a continuation of the source that I am talking about today. Masirul Umara takes the information about Mughal nobility till 18th century, and the information contained in Masirul Umra is on a large scale borrowed from Zakhiratul Khawanin. It's at some places it completely borrows the texts from Zakhiratul Khawanin. So there is Masirul Umra that is there, and apart from that, thank you so much, Shagufta. Can we have the next slide? The next one, I think. Yes, let's stop it here right now. Yeah. So the Masirul Umara is another text which talks about which is written in the similar genre, which talks about the Mughal nobles, and it takes the information till 18th century. Apart from that, there were other texts like Masir Rahimi, Masirul Kiram, Tazkiratul Umara, which were written in the same genre. They were Tazkiras talking about Mughal nobility, and they were using information from varied sources, and they were presenting an information about their lives, about their the kind of lives they lived, the kind of food they ate, the kind of courts they maintained at their own levels. So this is the kind of genre of source that we are talking about today. Moving ahead, can I have the next slide, please? The next slide. Yes, let's talk about the composition of the source at hand right now. So, as I told you, people, that the source was compiled in 1651. It was compiled after the author, Sheikh Farid Bhakkari, retired from his active service in Mughal bureaucracy, and he wrote this particular text in 1651 at Bhakkar. And given the amount of information and the nature of information, so in a number of places, he sometimes quotes from people in first person. So he quotes the information, he gives a detailed information about various aspects, about various events, and that detail and that first-hand account and that quoting of things from other sources suggests that he might have kept a record of the information over the years, which he finally composed or compiled together in this particular source that he wrote in 1651. Next slide, please. Right. So before going ahead, before going about what are the details contained in the source, let's talk about the audience of the source. Then and now also. The audience of the source at that particular point of time is obviously limited by the language in which it was composed. Zakhiratul Khawanin is a Persian tazkira. It is written in Persian language, and obviously it aimed at people, at audience who knew Persian, who could read and understand Persian. That reduces the readership to an elite few, to the people who were literate and to the people who were literate in Persian. But there is an important aspect that we need to look at when we talk about this particular tazkira, and that is the aspect of a wide variety of Hindavi terms and local terms, colloquial terms that were used in this particular source. And that wide variety of terms, that Hindavi that was used in this particular source, might have led to the source having a wider readership. Next slide, please. This here, I show you people an example of the kind of Hindavi that is used in this particular text. So at one point, Sheikh Farid Bhakkari quotes a Hindi proverb. It is a saying in Hindi which says, "Aag laganti jhopdi, jo nikle so labh." It is written in Persian. It is the script is Persian, but the saying itself is a colloquial saying that goes about amongst the common people. And that is why I suggest, and this is just one example, there are many more examples that are there of such use of Hindavi sayings in the text, and not just sayings, but use of terms as well. There are use of Hindavi terms that are there within the text. Some of the Hindavi terms that are there can be like, he uses the term odhni, baghar, sag, dhobi ghat. So these are the terms that are there that are used time and again repeatedly throughout the source, and that suggests that it's not just a Persian text. It also has incorporated a lot of Hindavi terms, and that Hindavi in the text, that Hindavi incorporation in the Persian of this particular text might also suggest that there was a wider readership or wider, people, wider audience that could have read this particular source, that could have understood this particular source when they would hear it. So this is something that I wanted to point out in the very beginning. Next slide, please. Okay, so this was about the audience and reception when in the time when it was composed. That was around 17th century. Now let's talk about the modern times. When did it get published? How did it get published? So the source was largely unknown for a long period of time. And the source that was more popularly known amongst the scholars of history was the source that I mentioned earlier, that is Masirul Umara. Masirul Umara was more popularly known by the scholars, and Zakhiratul Khawanin was relatively less known. And it was only at a particular time when this particular the manuscript of this text were discovered by Abdullah Chaghtai, who wrote about the source in 1935. So he wrote about the source, he had come across a manuscript of this source, and he published a paper. In that paper, he talked about this particular source. The paper was published in Islamic Culture, 1935. And the title of his paper, Abdullah Chaghtai's paper, was A Treasury of Biographical Sketches of Great Men. So that in 1935 did we come to know of this source that existed, and that was prior to Masrul Umara, which was more popularly known by then. Eventually, this source, the Persian text of this source was published by Historical Research Society of Pakistan. It was published under the leadership of Dr. Sayyid Muinul Haq. The source has 3 volumes. It still has 3 volumes, and the 3 volumes were published from 1961 to 1974. First volume in 1961, then in 1970, and then eventually final volume in 1974. So this was the publication of the source, the Persian text of the source, and it was done in Pakistan. Eventually, the source was translated. Can I have the next slide, please? Yes, so this is a copy of the Persian text published by Historical Research Society of Pakistan. Next slide. Eventually, the source was published, it was translated and published in English. Can I have the next slide, Shagufta? Yes. So the text was translated as the Dhakiratul Khawanin. I don't know why the Arabization of the term, but this is the source that was translated and published by one of the leading scholars and a person who has worked extensively on Persian sources, Persian epigraphy, and not just Persian, Arabic also. So Ziauddin Ahmad Desai translated this source. The first volume of this source was published in 1993, and the second and the third volume of the Persian text were translated and published together. Next slide. That source was published in 2003 posthumously after the death of Ziauddin Ahmad Desai. So this is the journey that this source has taken over a period of time. It was for a long period of time unknown to the scholars of history, and eventually in 1935 there were manuscripts who were discovered by this Abdullah Chaghtai. He had come across a manuscript in Osmania University, Hyderabad, and then eventually from there it came to the modern light, and eventually it was translated by Ziauddin Ahmad Desai. Next slide. So this is the reception of the source. Now I'll just briefly look at the author of the source, and for this particular information, I would thank Professor Rezavi. As Shagufta mentioned, Professor Rezavi has a paper on the life sketch of Sheikh Farid Bhakkari, and I have taken majorly from his paper. So Sheikh Farid Bhakkari was a Mughal bureaucrat, and we know that he joined services under Mughal nobles under Abdul Fateh Dakkani in 1592, and from then on he had been continually in service of the Mughal nobles, various Mughal nobles, till 1649. This information that he was himself in service of various Mughal nobles is important because we need to understand his proximity to the subject that he is talking about. This gives authenticity to the kind of information that he provides us, because he was himself a part of that milieu. He was himself a part of that bureaucratic setup, and that placement that Sheikh Farid Bhakkari had within the Mughal nobility, within the Mughal bureaucracy, that proximity, that placement that he had provides him with a lot of authenticity, because he was close, he saw things that he talked about up close, and that is why the information contained in the source can be accepted on its face value. It needs to be critically analyzed, obviously, but the proximity gives certain credibility to the author and the information contained in the source that he writes. So this is why knowing about Sheikh Farid Bhakkari is very important, because he was a part of that particular setup. The other details are there. He himself talks about his own descent, his own ancestry. in the text, Zafiyatul Khawanin, he talks about that. And it is not the only text that he wrote. He also wrote another book which talks about the family of Etimaduddaulah, the family of the father of Noor Jahan, the famous Noor Jahan. So this is more or less about the author. Can we move ahead? Yes. Now comes the interesting part. I have at various points in my research work borrowed extensively from this source. I have written on social aspects, on cultural aspects, on gender history, and this source has provided ample information for a wide range of subjects, for a wide range of interests that I have. My understanding and my interests are the mirror or are the glasses through which I see this particular source. The categories that I will now give before you, that I'll present before you, are obviously categories of analysis from my own understanding. They are completely subjective, and they can be, you can look at this source from a very different angle as well. So having said that, the source provides information in the form of first biographies, biographical accounts. It talks about nobles. Where do they come from? What is their lineage? What is their position at that particular point of time? Then it provides anecdotes. It provides verses from various nobles. Sheikh Farid Bakari himself composed verses, and he has produced those verses in the text. So this is the kind of information that we have. And can we have the next slide? Yeah. So I have used the source to provide information for, two broad categories, social aspects and cultural aspects. Next slide. The social aspects would include largely the categories of religion, caste, race, sect, women and gender, and the class-based divide of servants and masters and slaves. I will go into the details when I talk about these specific aspects. On the cultural front, the source provides a lot of information about the culinary habits, food habits, eating habits, cooking habits of the nobles, and it also provides information about material culture, built heritage, built culture. So these are the categories through which I would look at the source from now on for the rest of my talk. Can we have the next slide, please? Yes. So I hope this particular introduction that I provided to the source about the genre, about the author, about the kind of information contained in the source was clear enough for you all. And now I would take a completely different outlook to the source. I am going to talk about the information contained in the source. I'm not going to look it from the outside. I'm going to talk about the information that is there within the source. I have given, throughout the slides, I have given the volume and the page numbers. The volume and the page numbers are from the Persian texts. A copy of that particular Persian text is available in the Department of History Library. I have used that Persian text for my study. Moving ahead. I'll start talking about the social aspects, and we'll start with community identities. Now, what I'm going to say today, or from now in a few seconds, is not something new. It has already been talked about. It has already been established by various scholars, from say Professor Romila Thapar to Professor Irfan Habib to Rajmohan Gandhi to Richard Eaton, and more recently Dr. Audrey Kruschke. So what the source supplements, it complements the already established scholarship. What I'm going to talk about in the community identities is, very briefly, that the more prominent communities or the community identities to which nobles adhered were not the quote-unquote modern religious identities, were not the identities of a Hindu and a Muslim as we talk about in modern terms, but they were the identities of caste, they were the identities of race, and they were the identities of sect. Regarding the category of religion, or what we understand as modern religion of Hindus and Muslims, there are two terms that have been used to refer to what we today understand as modern Hindus. The terms are Kufara and Hunud. These are the terms that have been used in their various forms in their variants, and the text refers to what we understand as modern day Hindus through these terms. I think most of the audience would be familiar to these terms. The term kufara is a derivative of kafir, which would mean unbelievers in, say, Muslim understanding or Islamic understanding. And hunud largely refers to, say, the inhabitants of Hind, the inhabitants of India, Indian subcontinent. Right, so these are the terms that are used. Next slide. In the text, there are examples. I'll take token examples here. The term kafir is used to refer to, say, Raja Man Singh when he is interested in Khusro, and when there is a rebellion that is being led against Jahangir in the name of Khusro, and Raja Man Singh is involved in that political turmoil. And Jahangir is reported to have said in this text, to have called Raja Man Singh a kafir in this particular text. Right? And another instance that we take is of Abdullah Khan Feroz Jung, who refers to a war in which he, gained victory over Kufara, a plural of kafir. Next slide. So these are the two instances in which the term kafir has been used. These are token examples. These can be multiplied from the information contained in the source. Abdullah Khan Feroz Jung obviously is boasting of his achievements in the war, and Jahangir is obviously seeing Raja Man Singh as a threat to his sovereignty. That is why these are the political situations in which the term kafir is used. Where is hunud used, on the other hand? Hunud or the term Hindu or Hinduan is used in places where the reference is to common masses, to the people inhabiting the land of Hind. For example, the masses inhabiting the territory of Khan-e-Jahan Lodi's establishment are referred to as hunud. Right, next slide. So these are the things that we find out in the source, and this is something that complements the already established scholarship around the issue of the identities that were there in pre-modern setup. The identities of modern day religion were not prevalent at all in a pre-modern setup. Apart from the cases where there were certain political issues involved, as in the case of Raja Man Singh and Jahangir, the references to so-called Hindus are on the basis of their caste. So there are a number of examples. I've given a few here. Raja Man Singh is referred to as a Rajput who held governorship of Bengal. There was Rai Mukund Das, who was addressed as a Kayasth. Raja Todarmal is addressed as a Khatri. So all these Hindus, quote unquote Hindus, were referred according to their castes and not their, not called Hindus, quote unquote. So it's not the modern day identity of Hindus and Muslims cannot be read back into the past. And this is something that the source, shows, and by reading the source in that light, we come across this information. Moving ahead, this was the case with what we understand as modern day Hindus. Next slide, please. Yeah. So apart from the caste divide that is visible in what we understand today as Hindus, in case of modern day Muslims, the more prominent community identities that seem prevalent in the text are those of race and sect. Race, as in there is an example here of a Khan-e-Jahan. The image that is there on the screen is an illustration from Badshah Nama, and it is of the death of Khan-e-Jahan Lodi. Khan-e-Jahan Lodi was a very prominent Afghan who was employed under Jahangir, and he rebelled under Shah Jahan. There is a detailed information about all those political events in the Tazkira that we are talking about today. And apart from that, there is a sneak peek into what was the issue at hand. So, in Mughal understanding, in Mughal, what can you say? In the Mughal imagination, the most prominent enemy, according to this particular Tazkira, comes out to be the Afghans. Now, this can be this can be reminiscent of the time of Sher Shah Suri. He was the one who overthrew Humayun from his settlement in India, and it is reported in the text that Akbar was advised by Mirza Aziz Koka that he should deport all the Afghans from his territories. And Akbar is reportedly from this source, Akbar gave these orders, but they could not be implemented because there was a logistical issue of transferring these crores of men from the Indian territory. So in the imagination, in the Mughal understanding, the major enemy, the major threat to the empire were not the indigenous people, were not the Rajputs, Kayas, Khatris, and others. The major threat were the Afghans. And apart from that, this is one token example. We have Khan-e-Jahan Lodi talking about how he does not want to ruin the fate of Afghans by raising a banner of rebellion. This is also there in the text. It is not quoted here, but in the biographical account of Khan-e-Jahan Lodi, he is reportedly saying this. It is within quotes in that Sheikh Farid Bhakkari is reporting about Khan-e-Jahan Lodi. Apart from that, apart from this racial divide that is visible in the text, there's also a sectarian divide. I have not provided here examples of that because there are many, but there are certain. I can mention a few for understanding. For example, Sheikh Farid Bhakkari. The understanding of Sheikh Farid Bhakkari and his consciousness is very concerned about who is a Shia, who is a Sunni, who is a follower of a Mahdavi order, who is not, who is converting from Mahdavi sect to the sect of other sect. Some people are reported to have converted to Shiism, for example, Mahabat Khan. So all these things are very prominent in the consciousness of Sheikh Farid Bhakkari, and if we take his consciousness as representative of his time, then we can say that it was a racial divide and the sectarian divide that was very prominent in the minds of what constituted modern day Muslims in pre-modern setup. Moving ahead, next slide. Yes, so this was about the divide. This was about the conflict that is there, that is reported in the Tazkira. Now let's talk about the cooperation and the commonness and the common outlook that is also reflected in the text. Some very interesting accounts, and one incident and one information that I find very, very interesting is the next one. Is there on the next slide. But before going into that, let's talk about this one. Raja Man Singh is reported to have said that a prayer by a Muslim and jap by a Hindu are essentially the same, because they are talking about worship of God. They are talking about itaat-e ilahi, and that is why they are the same. Next slide. Now, this is something that I find very fascinating and very interesting, and this is something that is there in the source. Farid Bhakkari talks about an incident where Chinkilij Khan is excavating, digging land to build his mansion, and he comes across a jogi, a saint, an ascetic who was buried in earth. Now, this is obviously a fantastic tale, but the important aspect that we can take back from this tale is the common consciousness of Hindu and Muslim thought. Let's talk about what the jogi said, what is reported in the text. So according to the text, this particular jogi was discovered buried within the earth, and he was sitting facing Qibla, the Kaaba, Muslim, the direction towards which Muslims pray. So he was sitting towards that, and when he was dug out, he spoke in Hindavi according to the text, and he asked about Lord Ram and events of the Ramayana, and he was told that all those events have taken place. Then he asked about Lord Krishna and if he had come in Mathura, and what are the events that have taken place after Lord Krishna had come. And he was told about all those events as well. He was told that all these things have taken place. In continuity of those questions, he asked about Prophet Muhammad, if Prophet Muhammad had come to Arab and if these things have taken place. And he was informed that that also has taken place. And eventually he talked about the holy river Ganges. And eventually the text reports that this ascetic died in a few days. So now a fantastic story, but a reflection of the time it is talking about. It is a reflection of the common outlook, the common consciousness, and the commonness that is there between what is understood to be Hindu mythology and what is understood to be Muslim mythology. So Muslim history and Hindu history are combined together in this one incident, and it can be seen as a reflective of a common consciousness that was held in Mughal India, in pre-modern Mughal, consciousness that was there in pre-modern Mughal setup. So this is a story that I hold very dear. This is something that I find very fascinating, and that is there in the Tazkira. Next slide. So this is where I end the issue of community identities. The text regarding community identities definitely substantiates the already established argument. I reiterate it again. It is not something new. It is something that has already been established, and the text reiterates that and supplements that. Now let's talk about gender. So one purview was community identities. The other purview that I talk about is of gender. In gender, we have in very interesting information. So there's information that is confusing. It reflects some kind of bigotry that is there towards women. And I'm not just going to talk about women, I'm also going to talk about Khwaja Saras, the eunuchs, who were very important in Mughal administrative setup. So regarding women, the text reports two kinds of information. One, where women are seen performing manly functions. They are seen fighting battles. They are seen, running karkhanas. And they are also seen as objects of shame. They are also seen as objects of evil and stupidity in that sense. So the text talks about how women donned men's attire and fought in battle. This one image that we have is of Noor Jahan. It is a representative image. We don't have any visual representation of women fighting battles, donning men's clothes. But this can be a representative of that kind of attire, and we have information for that. Next slide. And we have also information where men and Farid Bhakkari included in those men call women, next slide, call women stupid. They say that they are deficient in intellect, and women's clothes were associated with shame. When two nobles failed to defend the fort at Patna, they were supposed to be paraded in the city wearing women's attire, and that was something that was humiliating for the people, for the nobles who could not defend the fort. Next slide. So this was one of the things attached with women, the idea of shame. The other ideas that were attached to women were that of them being stupid, them being deficient in intellect, as Khan-e-Jahan Lodi calls them. They are called naqisul aql, deficient in aql, and also they are called as people or objects who entertain vain ideas in their head. So Hakim Masur Zama is reported to have said this particular thing that is quoted on the screen, that as long as women have no work for them, they entertain evil ideas, they entertain khayal batil. And this was in response to a question that was asked by the author, Sheikh Farid Bhakkari. Sheikh Farid Bhakkari asked Masur Zama, whose female servants were working incessantly. They were working day and night, and they were given no rest. And Sheikh Farid Bhakkari asked him, "Why are you doing this to the women?" To which Masur Zama said that they need to work. If they don't work, they're going to entertain these vain ideas, these evil ideas. So this is something that is there in the source. Now, this can be a representative of the time. This can be the attitude that was there at that particular point of time towards women, where they are considered evil, they are considered stupid, they are considered, objects of shame, but also they are the ones who are running the karkhanas, who are, doing labor, who are fighting in battles. So this is a contradictory picture that is there, and this is probably representative of the time that the text talks about. Next slide. Similar bigotry and similar, contradiction is seen in the case of Khwaja Saras. Now, Khwaja Saras were eunuchs, and these people were very important, the Mughal setup, because not only for maintaining the harem, as is popularly known, but they were also holding important administrative positions. They were, next slide, they were holding positions of, these are the few examples that I've taken from the text. So they were establishing localities, they were the Faujdar of the capital, they were governing important cities. For example, Khwaja Wafadar was sent to govern Ahmedabad, which was a very important strategic location. So these are the Khwaja Saras are working and performing important administrative duties, but again they are considered to be baboons, they are considered to be evil, and the power that is exercised by them is seen as, they're seen as unworthy of the power that is exercised by them. Next slide. And Sheikh Farid Bhakkari himself seems to be thinking on those lines. Sheikh Farid says, can we go up? Right. So Sheikh Farid Bhakkari says, as you can see, he says how the power enjoyed by Khwaja Aga in the time of Shah Jahan was something that is not, that his position could not afford, that he should not be, given. And also there are other instances. For example, Khwaja Sara Khwaja Hilali is there, who built a mansion in vicinity of Agra, and that mansion was taken over by a noble who liked it, and the Khwaja Sara, despite investing so much in that mansion, in that building that he had built for himself, he could not take it over because Akbar did not take any stand for the Khwaja Sara. So these are the things that are representative of the kind of oppression or the kind of say subjugation that is faced by these Khwaja Saras, the so-called third gender of medieval times. And even though they are in possession of power, even though they are in possession of authority, they're still seen as not worthy of it. They're still seen as somebody who can be easily, the things that can be easily attached, snatched from them, things that they hold dear can be easily taken away from them. And they can also be very easily stabbed for simply speaking rudely. So there is an example of Khwaja Atamad Khan. Atamad Khan is the one who established a settlement near Agra, Atamadpur, which still is there. And that location, that Khwaja Atamad was killed by a soldier simply because he spoke rudely to him. And there is, no mention of any punishment that was leveled against that soldier. So all these, this kind of information is there in the source, is there in the text, and this gives us an idea of kind of lives and ambiguity in the lives of people belonging to the second gender and the third gender in that sense. Next slide. Apart from this, obviously, there is information about slaves, about servants, about the kind of lives they lived. In my other papers in which I have written about slaves and servants, I have argued that there seems to be an ambiguity, and the social position of the slaves and the servants depended on their immediate masters. So there was not an established norm that is there. We know that Akbar freed his slaves and called them chelas, and Noor Jahan is reported to have freed her slave girls and called them sahelis, but their actual condition did not improve. Yet we have certain examples of these chelas, these freed slaves, holding important positions. For example, we have Baqi Beg Chela, who was Kotwal of Lahore, and we have Jamshed Chela, who held a mansab in the time of Shah Jahan. But these are obviously token examples of freed slaves gaining social mobility and social, going up in the social hierarchy. Majority of these slaves lived miserable lives, and the act of freeing these slaves was something that was only a change in nomenclature. It has been argued elsewhere by Professor Irfan Habib. So this is where about the chelas, Professor Habib has written in one of his articles. So this is, and that kind of information we receive from this source as well, despite getting information about a few of them gaining social mobility. Next slide. Yes, and about sahelis as well. Chelas are seen to have held some authority, but the Sahelis, the female slaves who were freed, they do not even appear to have gained any mobility at all. They were at the mercy of their lords. For example, Khana Jahan Lodi's Sahelis were mercilessly left to die when he fled after his rebellion, and he seems to have no guilt or no reproach for whatever the attitude that he held towards his Sahelis, right? But yet we see Noor Jahan Begum trying to do an act of social service by getting her Sahelis married to the Ahadis and the Chelas, and we have other instances where Sahelis were freed in cases when there was an issue of performing social service. When there was somebody sick, the Sahelis were freed as an act of piety so that the sick might recover. So these are the kind of instances, this mixed information of oppression and of liberation, of social mobility and of social oppression. And that is why I argue that it was mostly dependent on the immediate master, immediate lord, the condition of the slaves and the Sahelis and the Chelas. Next slide. Now, very briefly, I'll talk about the cultural aspects because I think I have exceeded the time that was allotted to me. We have references to various foods that were consumed, various edible items that were consumed in the Mughal nobility, and very importantly, we have a number of references to pan and wine. Both these things were held as social objects of social consumption. They were consumed in social gatherings, and apart from that, we have information about various kinds of feasts. There were feasts of urs. There were feasts of when any noble would come to visit the king. There were feasts there, and Akbar reportedly said something about an ideal feast in Mughal India, which contained roasted teetar and some leafy vegetables, which he calls as saag, which were put before the guest. Anybody who was supposed to be treated in an elaborate, honorable manner was served these things. Next slide. Another important thing that we get to know from this source is about the daily food habits of people. So on a daily basis, there was consumption of khichdi. So khichdi is something that is an everyday name in our households as well, and that was something that was very much liked by the Mughal nobles. There are reports of millet khichdi, rice khichdi, and other types of preparations that were made of khichdi during the Mughal time by various Mughal nobles. And apart from that, there were obviously saag and bhat, the rice that was there. So all these things were objects of daily consumption by the Mughal nobles, and these are the kind of information that we have. One very interesting story that I want to tell here, this is something that I find very funny, is that there was one noble, Mehtar Khan, and he was the governor of Agra, and one day he comes across this condiment which he finds very smell of which he finds very nice, and that condiment was hing that we use every day, and that's a strong smell that we have, and it is referred to in the text as anguzaha, which is a Persian term for hing. And Mehtar Khan liked the condiment so much that he rubbed it in his armpits and went to the court. And that was something that left the court in utter turmoil, because nobody liked the smell but Mehtar Khan only. And when he was inquired what he has done, why has he put hing in his armpits and he's smelling of it, so he reportedly said that I am a poor man, hum to gharib hain, ma gharibas, and how can we afford hing, and it is only with the mercy of the king here, the emperor here, that I have been able to afford hing, and I have used it and powdered it and put it in my armpits, and that is why I smell so good. So this is something that was there, that is reported, and obviously it talks about the kind of world that was there, inhabited by the Mughal nobles, the objects of food that these people are familiar with, and obviously some funny anecdotes that are there, that are put up in the text here and there, and these are something that provide a good laugh when you read the text. Next slide. Apart from these objects of consumption, there were obviously objects of pan and wine, which I mentioned in the beginning. These and wine is something that is considered to be something that is considered today to be in Islamic, or something that is haram or forbidden. But that was not the case in pre-modern world that we are talking about, that this Tazkira reports about. So Ram Rangi wine was a type of wine that was a favorite of Jahangir, and it was offered to Khane Jahan Lodi, and whoever was offered the wine first was considered to be in favors of the king. So this was a social aspect that was associated with these food items. Regarding pan also, we have an incident where Raja Man Singh, because of his caste considerations, when he could not have food with the other Muslim nobles or other nobles that were there, he reportedly said that because I cannot have food with you people, I will, have pan with you people. And he offered pan to all the nobles who were present at that particular gathering. So these are the social aspects that are there of pan and wine that we find a number of mentions in the text. These are some token examples. Next slide. Yes. So now I'll just conclude with this particular aspect of architecture, of built heritage. In my work on architecture, I have extensively borrowed from this text. There are references to structures which were built by nobles, structures that ranged from their own mansions to religious buildings to public utilitarian buildings. So there is a wide range of things that were constructed. Some information that is there in the text, for example, the text talks about a new kind of architectural trend that was started at Agra by Atiqad Khan, and these were the things that were not seen before in the city. For example, construction of hammam within a garden was something that was very new, and a new architectural trend that was started, about which Sheikh Farid Bhakkari reports. Next slide. So we have these references. We have references of construction of public utility structures. Mahabad Khan reportedly demolished a lot of tombs that were there in Delhi to construct sarais and to construct buildings of public utilitarian nature. We have those references as well. And also we have references of construction of religious buildings. Both mosques and temples were reportedly built. Next slide. And interestingly, we have a reference of the construction of the Jami Masjid at Lahore. It was constructed or commissioned by Raja Man Singh and his father. And this is something that is very interesting to note, because construction of mosque by what we understand as a Hindu noble is something that is very intriguing and very interesting, and something that is representative of the time that the text talks about. So there was no religious, clash as we see it today, or as we try to read in the past. So that is how we, this is the kind of information that we get from the source. And I would conclude here. I would thank the audience for patiently listening to me. I hope there are questions that would be there. I hope I was able to introduce you the source that is something that holds information of a varied range of things, from Mughal social order, social structure, Mughal, various classes that were there under Mughals, and also various cultural aspects. I have given certain token examples. These examples can be multiplied, and obviously the categories of analysis that I have used can be questioned, can be changed, and new scholars can look at this source from completely fresh angle. But the importance of this source, I hope I was able to establish. Thank you.
Thank you, Libna. Thank you for a very informative lecture. So now we are going to have certain questions. For example, Tarun Mathur asks a very basic question. Any reference to Rai Raghunath Mathur?
Not that I remember, but obviously there are references to a number of nobles. It's not humanly possible to remember all of them right now, because there are 3 volumes of it. There might be a mention, but something that I don't remember for now.
Yeah, Tarun, it's basically, a text where biographies of the, various nobles have been given, both Hindu and Muslim, yes, Iranian and, Turkish. foreign and indigenous, all type of people have been mentioned there. And if I remember correctly, then Raghunath has been mentioned, he being a very important noble. So he has been, I'm 90% sure that I have seen it. He has been mentioned there, he being a very important personality of that period of time. Next question, please. Amita Paliwal has a question. Farid Bakri's book has lots of Hindavi terms, which is a general practice by almost all the Sindhi contemporary writers, whether Qani, Thattavi, or Masumi. Probably because of popular Sufi culture in the extreme western corner of India in the 17th century. Her question is, does the source talk about the powerful women in Suba Sindh?
So thank you, Amita ma'am, for this amazing question regarding women. So interestingly, the source does not mention any powerful women at all, except for one. It mentions Noor Jahan, and it reports about Noor Jahan as Nawab Noor Jahan Begum, and it gives a detailed account of her ancestry, her lineage, and what her life is, and what did he do. For example, it reports about the various new trends in fashion that she started. It talks about Do Dami Oढ़ni and all the other things that were initiated by Noor Jahan, and then it talks about the social activities that were performed by her. But apart from Noor Jahan, there is no mention of any not mentioned as a noble, not in the biographical dictionary. No women apart from Noor Jahan is mentioned in a separate heading. There is a mention of powerful women within the biographical accounts of various nobles. We get information about Mirzas, and we get information about the women who were associated with these nobles. We have mention of that, but apart from Noor Jahan, there is hardly anybody who is reported as as a powerful figure, as a prominent figure in the Mughal world, which is something that can be looked into in future researches.
Well, I will, Amita has also a second, the first query or a first comment which she has made is regarding the Hindavi terms being used by almost all the contemporary Sindhi authors. Let me say it is not confined only to Sindhi authors. In fact, even Abul Fazl uses a lot of Hindavi terms. It is not a question of influence of Sufism. It was the development of a common language during that period, which forced the authors to use terms which could be understood by the audience. So the Hindavi terms which are occurring just shows that there is a cultural mixing which is taking place and a new language is emerging. That is all. It has nothing to do, in my understanding.
Exactly. Sufism cannot be given the credit of doing that.
That cannot be given.
That was there.
Next one, please. Please ask the question. Lakshmikant Mishra, as the text covers a long period of time besides the personal experiences, what more sources were used by Sheikh Farid in writing the text? How have filtered the credentials by comparing the same with other Tazkiras?
Right. So the information that Farid Bakri produces is primarily his own personal, what would you say, understanding from his own personal encounters. But he has also taken information from Nizamuddin Ahmad's work from about the time of Akbar, and he also takes information from Jahangir's memoirs. So we have this information about this. Ziauddin Ahmad Desai has written extensively in the introduction of the source that he has written when he published the English translation. So the information that is there in Sheikh Farid Bhakkari's text is first his own first-hand experiences. Then he has also borrowed from Nizamuddin Ahmad, and he has also borrowed from Jahangir's works. So Jahangir's diary, Jahangir's memoirs. So these are the sources of information that are there, and definitely the credentials of the source need to be questioned, need to be compared with other sources of that particular period of time, and they need to be put into place, because we cannot take the source at its face value, because there are certain biases that are very clearly visible in the case of Sheikh Farid Bhakkari, and it needs to be comparatively analyzed with the sources from the time period. One example I'll take here is that of Khane Jahan Lodi. So Khane Jahan Lodi was one of the employers of Sheikh Farid Bhakkari, and Sheikh Farid Bhakkari was in a very difficult position because he had to, he was writing in the time of Shah Jahan, and Khane Jahan Lodi had rebelled in the time of Shah Jahan, and in the entire biographical account of Khane Jahan Lodi, you can see that he is trying to provide an apology or an apologetic justification of the actions of Khane Jahan Lodi, and this is something that can be, checked against the sources, the official sources that were written at that time, and other sources that were composed in the time of Shah Jahan. So there needs to be a critical analysis, a comparative study, which would bring about the which would bring about the actual information, the truth, and the biases that were there, that were possessed by the author of the text.
Let us have the question of Leher Zedi. Leher Zedi asks, first comments, didn't Mahabad Khan also consider his Rajput soldiers as his sons, even during his rebellion or coup against Salih?
Yes. So, yes. So, thank you, Leher. And regarding Mahabad Khan refers to Rajputs as his sons. He refers to Rajputs as the people who would take his lineage, or not lineage per se, but legacy forward. And the text reports extensively in detail about that. It talks about, Sheikh Farid Bhakkari mentions that Mahabad Khan says that Rajputs were the reason why my name has been raised aloft in Mughal Empire, and I am only successful and powerful because of these Rajputs. And eventually, at the time of the death of Mahabad Khan, he gave Rajputs the charge of his whatever treasure he had, whatever dominion he had, and his own dead body. He wanted Rajputs to take the dead body of his own dead body to a particular location where he wanted to get buried. So he held absolute trust in Rajputs. But he's also reported to have said in the text that Rajputs know how to die, they don't know how to fight. So there is a very interesting aspect and very interesting details that we get about various elements of Mughal society from the source.
Another question by Mirza Hasnain. Very simple. Was Farid Bhakkari from Sindh? Does he provide information about the Mughal city of Thatta in Sindh and noble of Sindh?
Yes, so Farid Bhakkari belonged to Sindh Bhakkar, and he provides detailed information about the topography, the land, the nobles from there, and the various building activities that were done in that particular region. I don't remember the exact name of the person who made that particular noble, but who made that particular structure. But he's reportedly mentioned a Gumbad-e-Darya that was built in Sindh by one of the nobles, and it was a beautiful structure according to Sheikh Farid Bhakkari. So he gives detailed information about the building activities that were done in Sindh and especially his own hometown, and he gives detailed information about that.
Actually, Mirza Hasnain, the thing is that, as Lubna pointed out, that this text which we are dealing with, Zakhiratul Khawani, is a zakhira of the nobles, not of places.
Also, I think, yes.
He mentions not only Thatta and Bhakkar and other places, but sometimes goes on to discuss a large number of towns and places to which a particular noble belonged to. In fact, this source becomes a very important source even for those who are working on the cities of the 17th century. There's while discussing the nobles, while discussing their architectural endeavors, there is much information on various cities of the Mughal Empire, and naturally, Sindh being his own place of origin, there is much information regarding Sindh, Thatta, and Bakkar.
If I may add, sir, here, because I just looked at the information that is there. So he talks about in volume 1, page 177 of the Persian text, he talks about the old fort of Bhakkar, and he talks about how it was reconstructed in Pakka bricks by Mirza Jani Beg Tarkhan. And there is this is one token example of the information that he provides of his native town, Bhakkar. He talks about Mir Abul Qasim Namakin, who made various constructions at Bhakkar. He talks about the mosques and other structures that were built in that city. So his location and his native place was Bhakkar, and that is why he provides much more detail about that place. And the name of the noble who built Gumbad-e-Darya was none other than Mir Muhammad Masoom Bhakkari, and he gives detailed account of that structure, that water dome Gumbad-e-Daryai, that was constructed in the middle of the river. So this detailed information that is there about the city of Bhakkar because of his own location in Bhakkar. So yeah.
So Zainab Naqvi also has a question for you, and Zainab first thanks you and for a good lecture. Then says, since the source is located in the Mughal political milieu, are there references to incidents of competition and conflict among the nobles for attaining upward mobility or winning over the monarch in political arena of Mughal times? The rivalry between the nobles.
So the text itself does not very directly talk about, not very consciously talks about the conflict, but obviously there are references. For example, the instance that I talk about, the issue of Khane-Jahan Lodi holding prominence or holding, say, a special position in the case of Jahangir, in the times of Jahangir, and eventually he lost that political, favor in the time of Shah Jahan. Similar is the case with Mahabat Khan. So you'll have to complement the information from the text with certain other sources if you want to look at specific Mughal political, movement and Mughal political tussle between nobles. It is the hints are there, but there is no direct evidence. There is no direct reference. The direct reference of conflict is very much there in cases of community identities. For example, the sectarian divide, the racial divide. So those things are very directly mentioned, but favors from the king and favors from the emperor and favors from political authority is something that is hinted upon. But as far as I remember, there is no very not direct reference to that particular that particular kind of information, and you'll have to supplement that information from other sources. For example, he talks about Khane-Jahan Lodi's rebellion, but from a different angle. So you'll have to know from Shah Jahan's period sources that there was a rebellion, there was a political tussle. So that you have to supplement from other sources.
Well, a small query from Hasnain Aziz. Let's have Ali Hadar first. Does this text also talk about the noblemen during the reign of Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb? Does it provide information about the Safavid or Persian nobility in Mughal domains?
So it contains information of Shah Jahan's nobles till the time period of 1651, obviously, because that is the time period when the text was composed. Aurangzeb, it does not have any information. Obviously, the nobles who continue to serve under Aurangzeb after Shah Jahan, the information can be there. But specifically of Aurangzeb's time, there is no information. That information can be garnered from Masirul Umara, which has taken the source a bit further, biographical accounts of Mughal nobles a bit further. So that is there. And regarding Safavid or Persian nobility, there is obviously reference to the Persians who were employed or who were serving the Mughal authority under Akbar, under Jahangir, under Shah Jahan. It talks about, the text talks about, especially in the case of Jahangir, it talks about Itimaduddaulah's family, it talks about Abul Fazl's family. So it talks about various nobles, it talks about their lineage, it talks about where they come from, it talks about whether they're Turanis or Iranis or Indian Muslims or Afghans. So it talks about the lineage, it mentions that. But Safavid nobility, it does not talk about. It talks about the Mughal nobility, it talks about the Mughal nobles, and it does mention the racial affinities or the races to which these people belong to, which is something that held a lot of importance in consciousness of Sheikh Farid Bhakkari, as I can find out. I hope that works.
Ali Haider, the fact remains that Zaqiyatul Qawanin is a text which was completed during the period of Shah Jahan, and probably the author also did not survive that period. Obviously, one should not expect future information to be there. I mean, those nobles who were there during the Shah Jahan's, the reign of Shah Jahan, they ultimately, incidentally, also continued during the period of Aurangzeb. So, if you want to refer back to the period of Shah Jahan, how their trajectory was, coming forward, you can have a look at that. As far as the question of Safavids are concerned, as pointed out by the speaker, the text regards the Mughal Empire. It has nothing to do with the Safavids. So why talk about the Safavids? Why expect any information about the Safavids? Only those nobles, Iranian, and there were many. I mean, half the nobles mentioned are Iranians by origin. They migrated from Iran. Some of them had served the Safavid Empire also. So naturally, because now they are part of the Mughal Empire, they are mentioned, not because they are the Safavid nobles. So to expect information on Safavids is, I think, not correct. The next question would be, any other question?
There is one.
Aftaba. While talking about social communities as gleaned from the source of Bhakkari, to make such assertion that caste identities were frequently invoked at that time as compared to today's time, wherein more focus is on Hindu-Muslim identity, goes against the contemporary sociological investigations. This is a comment, not a question.
I can just say that sociologists and historians have been in tussle with each other for a very long time. So I can't go into the domain. So yeah. And as I said, regarding the issues of community identities, I already said that it is something that has been established by a range of scholars, from Professor Romila Thapar to Professor Irfan Habib to Richard Eaton to Audrey Truschke. So this particular line of argument where we see that reading Hindu-Muslim identity into the past is an anachronism, it is something that is not justified, it is something that is not okay, it is something that is ahistorical, is something that has already been established. And I am looking at the source, and the source is complementing that argument. It is not negating that argument, it is complementing that argument, and I'm simply stating that. So I hope
Right. Hasnain Aziz, which loyal Afghan or Pathan nobles are mentioned in the text?
So there are a number of nobles, a number of Afghan nobles are mentioned, and the most prominent amongst them is obviously Khan-e-Jahan Lodi. Khan-e-Jahan Lodi is mentioned as his lineage as Afghan, and there are a number of other nobles who are mentioned who were Afghan in descent in their ancestry. Regarding Khan-e-Jahan Lodi, I'll just add one more thing, that while he was in the time of Jahangir, he was a favored noble, but he was asked by other Afghans to raise to go into a rebellion against the Mughal authority. To which Khan Jahan Lodi apparently replied that he does not want to bring doom to Afghans, and he does not want to be the reason of cries of Afghan women later in life, because he knew that Mughals would come back and they would then take out their wrath on Afghans. So there's obviously you'll have to look at it critically, because Sheikh Farid Bhakkari somehow seems apologetic about Khan Jahan Lodi's activities. So there are a number of other nobles, other Afghan nobles which I mentioned, but Khan Jahan Lodi is one who holds a lot of prominence.
Lubna, thanks a lot for your lecture. I hope that this would go a long way to making general people understand the importance of these texts, these tazkiras. In fact, no history of the Mughal Empire, at least the administrative and political history of the Mughal Empire, though you demonstrated today that other aspects also cannot be written unless and until one goes through texts like Zakhiratul Khawani. In fact, these tazkiras, this whole concept of tazkira started with the tazkiras or anecdotes and the life accounts of the religious people, the Sufis, the sheikhs and others. Ultimately, the tazkiras were written regarding the imperial authorities, and then in this were included the prominent personalities of the time. While the importance of Farid Bhakkari, which I have understood, is that Farid Bhakkari does not give information only about the nobility, but within the accounts of the nobles, there is much information regarding the common people themselves, the culture, the habits, as you rightly pointed out, the food habits, so on and so forth. This Tazkira, Zakhiratul Khawani, is also important, and you rightly pointed it out in the beginning of your lecture, that it deals with a large number of Hindavi terms. I remember that there was one of the professors at Aligarh who has retired, Professor Afzal Hussain, who had worked on the nobility of Jahangir. He had written a very beautiful article on the uses of Hindavi in these Persian texts, and how these terms are occurring there. When you say that these Hindavi terms were written in Persian script, well, of course, the whole text is being written in a particular script, so that is not something which one has to point out. Remember, Hindavi is the common ancestor of what today we call as Hindi and Urdu. What is interesting, however, is that during that period, possibly the time period when that muhavra which you had, that proverb which you had depicted, probably that period was the period of Shah Jahan, during whose period that muhavra was written. Jahangir or Shah Jahan, possibly. But that shows that by